Hello, and welcome to the fifth week of Choices, Foreign Policy Issues in the 2020 Election. My name is Matthew Hughes, and I serve as the Executive Director of the International Relations Council in Kansas City, and we are so glad to have you with us today. The International Relations Council strengthens Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. As a nonpartisan educational nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community's 21st century global acumen. We invite you to learn more about the International Relations Council, including other sessions in the Choices Election Issues series, other upcoming events, and how to join as a member on our website at irckc.org. The 2020 presidential election will present the American people with consequential choices around international challenges and the future of US foreign policy. In these 8 weeks leading up to November 3rd, we're talking with notable experts on foreign policy issues relevant to this year's election and what comes next. Rather than advocate a particular approach or outcome, the Nonpartisan Choices series is meant to inform voters through a presentation of historical context and a detailed examination of the foreign policy platforms of the major party candidates. We welcome diverse perspectives and encourage the community to join us in meaningful discourse around these issues of global importance. And we do hope that you'll engage with us that way this evening as we explore the military and diplomacy. We do welcome your questions through the course of the conversation using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And please check out and share the other conversations in the Choices series as we consider a range of critical foreign policy issues in the coming weeks. We are grateful to our sponsors who have made this evening's program and the Choices series possible. In particular, we thank supporting series sponsors Nancy C. Messer, the University of Missouri, and Buttonwood Financial Group. We also appreciate the contribution of supporting conversation sponsor, Park University. I'm now pleased to introduce our moderator for today's program, who will introduce our speaker and help us navigate the conversation. Dr. Jack MacLennan is Assistant Professor of Political Science at Park University, where he teaches international politics, comparative politics, and political theory. He will also be the director of Park's new master's program in national security studies. A native of New Brunswick, Canada, Dr. MacLennan's research interests include international relations theory, technology, security studies, and warfare. And Jack, we are so glad to have you with us today. Please take it away.
Well, thank you, Matthew. As the director of Park's National Security Studies graduate program, it's an absolute pleasure to have the opportunity to support events like this. Our program is an online national program that's purpose is to provide an educational environment attuned to national security affairs, but that is directed toward outreach and accessibility. And events like the IRC's Choices series are a fantastic example of a larger sort of popular engagement with these core issues, and we're more than happy to be a sponsor and to be involved. It's also my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Melissa Dalton, Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the International Security Program and Director of the Cooperative Defense Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Ms. Dalton is a Senior Fellow and Deputy Director at CSIS. Her CDP research focuses on reinforcing the principled foundations of US defense policy and military operations. She also frequently conducts research and writes on security cooperation with allies and partners and US defense policy in the Middle East. Prior to joining CSIS in 2014, Ms. Dalton served in a number of positions at the US Department of Defense in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy from 2007 to 2014. Previously, she served as Special Assistant to the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, as Policy Advisor to the Commander of the International Security Assistance Force in Kabul, Afghanistan, and as Country Director for Lebanon and Syria. In 2012, she was Visiting Fellow at the Center for a New American Security. Prior to her DoD service, she taught English to middle and high school students in Damascus, Syria in 2006. And from 2003 to 2005, she served as an intelligence analyst at the Defense Intelligence Agency. Finally, Ms. Dalton is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and was a CFR International Affairs Fellow. So welcome, Melissa.
Great. Thank you so much for the warm introduction, Jack. And I'm so grateful to Matthew and the IRC team for having me this evening to talk about the nexus of the military and diplomacy and looking ahead to how these issues might shape the future policy agenda of whether it's a second Trump administration or a Biden administration. We will see in a few weeks' time. So I'm going to provide some upfront thoughts, but really looking forward to a discussion with Jack this evening as well, and also hearing from you all and the questions and comments that you have. I understand it's a very seasoned and experienced group, so really looking forward to the discussion this evening. To start off, I think it's interesting to think about these issues if we take a stand back. We tend to separate the topics of military and diplomacy as two distinct topics in terms of academic disciplines. When you think about the military studies that you can take in graduate school or as an undergraduate, or perhaps in the service academies, it's very focused on military history, military strategy, military tactics. And when you talk about diplomacy, it's more about political science and the history of American diplomacy, European diplomacy, and its roots. So the disciplines behind these foreign policy topics are oftentimes somewhat siloed and segmented. You have to kind of consciously cross the boundaries in order to expose yourself to one or the other. There are also separate professional tracks for individuals that want to join the military or want to join the diplomatic corps, our foreign service. And of course, there are also a number of opportunities to serve in both defense and diplomacy as a career person, as I did. And then, certainly at the upper echelons of the Department of Defense and the Department of State, filled by political appointees. But oftentimes for the career folks that fill the ranks of our military and our diplomatic corps, they are also, unfortunately, oftentimes largely segmented. We also tend to think of the use of the military itself as a foreign policy tool as only becoming necessary when diplomacy fails. It's that tool that we reach for if all of the diplomatic steps that we've taken have faltered to that point. We can also think about the military as a credible deterrent or iron fist to strengthen a diplomatic position. If you think back to a few years ago when the Obama administration was negotiating the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action to deal with Iran's nuclear program in like the 2012 to 2013 time period, you may have heard that there was a commensurate surge of military forces into the region by the United States and its allies, and buttressing the military capabilities of partners in the region to buttress US presence in the region, to let Iran know that we were serious about the steps that they might take in their nuclear development. And that was seen as working hand in glove with the diplomatic track that was trying to pressure them to make some concessions, but still, largely two separate things. And so, whether it's thinking about academic disciplines or how we train and professionalize people for these different career tracks, or how they actually play out in our foreign policy, what we can often lose sight of is the fact that any use of the military is actually a very political act. And this gets back to a famous military theorist from the 19th century, Karl von Clausewitz, who's a Prussian general, who wrote a very famous book on war. Jack probably has it on his shelf behind him, and coining the term that or the phrase that war is an extension of politics by other means. And so what does this mean for thinking about military and diplomacy and the nexus between them, between the two? It's that the use of the military and diplomacy are an extension of our political objectives and how we use them to achieve our desired political outcomes. This is perhaps clearer when we think about very distinct historical examples. We fought the Nazis in World War II alongside our allies through a series of military battles that culminated in the Nazis' political defeat. That's a very clear linkage between what we were trying to achieve politically, the defeat of the Nazis, and how we used our military in concert with our allies to achieve that objective. Another historical example, we intervened militarily in Kuwait and Iraq in 1990 to push Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait to reset a political territorial boundary in order to uphold respect for states' territorial integrity. That was also a political act that we were undertaking by the use of our military. But when we think about other examples, perhaps more contemporary ones, when our political objectives and desired political outcomes are less clear, so too are the results of our military interventions. If we look back at the history of the last 20 years in the post September 11th era and the use of our counterterrorism capabilities, it's tough at times to determine what the distinct political objective is that we are trying to achieve in any given counterterrorism campaign. When we think about the George W. Bush administration and the global war on terror, there was definitely political momentum in that moment coming out of September 11th to be responsive to an attack on the homeland. That was quite compelling. It was compelling certainly to our allies in NATO that did respond with us in taking those initial strikes in Afghanistan under the Article 5 of our alliance with NATO. But as the tape rolled forward over the following years and we continued to use these counterterrorism capabilities of our military, but also from our intelligence community, depending on what country context you were looking at, or taking a step back and looking at the course of these counterterrorism campaigns, it grew harder over time to determine what it was that we were actually trying to achieve. Certainly degrading terrorist capabilities and particularly those that present a threat to the homeland is a serious matter, likely worthy of military intervention. But what is the affirmative political objective that we have been trying to achieve? It tends to break down when you take that step back. Another example where we've seen some of the disconnect between the clarity of our political objectives and our desired political outcomes have been some of the strikes that we've seen in the last number of years in Syria on chemical weapons facilities. Certainly there's an important non-proliferation objective that the Trump administration was trying to achieve. And you may reflect back that the Obama administration also seriously considered the use of military force to address Syria's chemical weapons threats as well. So, this is not unique to the Trump administration. But in the context of what the US government overall was trying to achieve in Syria, beyond that impulse to be responsive to chemical weapons usage and to try to set that line of deterrence, what were we actually trying to achieve in Syria, and how did that connect to what we were doing vis-a-vis terrorist networks in that country, vis-a-vis what we were trying to do to counter the Assad regime? It hasn't been quite clear what our political objectives are, how the use of our military is being connected to the use of diplomacy in these instances. And I think this has raised questions over time for the American public in questioning the quote unquote forever wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and more broadly in the greater Middle East.